He tasted metal and regret before he tasted anything else, the metallic tang of someone else's blood on his lip as a chair leg skidded across marble and glasses shattered into confetti of light. Elias Moretti's hand went to his side reflexively, where the scar beneath his suit had never quite stopped whispering old promises. The gunshot had not reached him, but the room had. A man in a too-clean suit and the polite arrogance of boardrooms stood at the foot of his private table, a silenced pistol clenched in white-knuckled fingers and a sealed NDA pinched between a thumb and a trembling breath. For one thin, absurd second, Elias thought the world had been reduced to contract and steel, until the boy came at them like a storm that smelled of gutters and rain. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. The attack should have been elegant, a takeover disguised as an accident, a rival CEO's muscle hidden behind lawyers' signatures. Gabriel Voss had chosen the private dining room at Ferrara, Elias's fortress of lamb chops and soft-spoken threats, because public spectacle would be a mistake and silence was currency. He intended the pistol to speak in whispers, the NDA to do the rest, a legal blade to jab at the Moretti fortune, to pull tendons of business from under a throne that, to him, smelled of old money and old men. Instead, chaos folded in on itself. Waiters dropped plates. A chandelier sheltered an avalanche of frightened diners. The shooter, Gabriel, impossibly composed in his arrogance, did not anticipate legs like knotted ropes and a small body as immediate as a thrown stone. Luca hit him with the speed of someone who had learned to move through slatted light and escape the reach of cowardly hands. There was nothing poetic in the way he sprang, a youth with a bruise-blackened knuckle and socks with holes, lungs hot with the city's frost. He had been at the doorway, Luca, who had been watching the restaurant for scraps, who had been stealing bread for 2 nights straight, and he saw a man about to make another man less than whole, and he moved. The gun slapped against Luca's temple. The sound was wet and cruel. Gabriel glanced up, eyes incredulous that his neat plan had been interrupted by a street kid. Then Luca's fist found Gabriel's jaw, and something ancient and small in Elias tightened. He had been around fists most of his life, had seen men beat men until bones quit arguing with cartilage. But this was not a beating given by training and muscle. Luca's rage was a pure, private mathematics, one need divided by the indignity of being used as a pawn, translated into violence. He struck as if he were defending a brother, a mother, the concept of hunger.
When the man fell, he fell like a CEO whose power had been written in bullet points but never tested against the animal calculus of a boy's desperation. The room smelled suddenly of cheap cologne and fear. Someone screamed, high, sustained, and the sound was swallowed by the clatter. For a long, tight moment, the world narrowed to the triangle of Elias, the fallen man, and the boy kneeling, panting, hands bloodied. Security was better than bad habits. The Moretti men moved like trained shadows. But Elias did not order iron that night. He watched. There was a ledger inside his skull that tallied debt and owed favors, and he had paid in silence for longer than he cared to count. The shock of being attacked in his own sanctuary should have provoked a roar. Instead, it provoked a look. One long look at the boy who had struck out at one of the world's polished predators and failed to crumble. Luca's eyes were black with the city. There was something else too, something like intelligence folded in on itself, wary and absurd. He stared at Elias as if the man represented knights he had not yet learned to name. Elias saw the grit on the boy's teeth, the ragged hem of a jacket too small for anyone, and the clean white band of a hospital bracelet tucked inside a pocket. A name card flapped on the table where Gabriel had been, Gabriel Voss, CEO, an absurd footnote for a man whose reach threaded under oceans and through servers. Yet the real disturbance was not the name. It was the fact that a boy had preferred ruin for a stranger to watching ruin happen to a man who was used to being dangerous. Phones recorded. A crowd gathered at the glass as cameras blinked like nervous insects. In under 5 minutes, the footage would be looped into 1,000 arguments about violence, class, and whether the Morettis were finally cracking. For Elias, it was quieter, an intersection where his rules touched someone else's survival, and the fabric between them flexed. He felt the old promise stir in his chest: keep the streets from turning on one another. He had kept that promise by being the shadow that collected debts and redistributed fear. He had kept it by making himself an immovable object in a world of slippery faces. But promises are not the same as absolutes. They bruise in the dark, and sometimes a child's fists remind you how fragile those promises can be. Gabriel, sprawled and winded, muttered lawyers' names and venture capital portfolios, even as the boy kicked at his hands. It was humiliating for a man who had reduced cities to balance sheets. He spat the word buyout, like a curse, like a baby's fist against reality. Luca didn't understand the word, but understood the sounds of power: money, a whisper of lawsuits, the cadence of men who hid behind contracts. He had experienced power only as hunger and cold and the occasional kindness of an old woman on the corner.
The contrast would have been a portrait if Elias had any patience for aesthetics. Instead, it struck him like a coin landing in a cracked fountain. Afterwards, when the police came and took half a dozen statements, none of them coherent, all of them curated, Elias walked out into the winter night, to the dome of the city, to the satellites that hummed overhead like a second sky. He should have called the board. He should have ordered reprisals. He should have asked questions about Gabriel Voss's audacity. Instead, he replayed the face of the boy in his head and found, to his own surprise, that he could not look away. Luca had faded back into the city as quickly as he'd appeared, one moment there, the next swallowed by alleys and a network of people who lived behind dumpsters and under scaffolding. Yet the boy had left more than a bruise on a lobby floor. He had left a wound in Elias's way of seeing the world. The attack had been intended to prove a thesis, that the syndicate could be undermined the way outdated businesses were supplanted, with sleep capital, with a lawyer's signature. Gabriel had not read the ledger of the streets. He had not accounted for petty human allegiance, for the kind of loyalty that is not bought, but forged in the heat of shared survival. Elias hadn't either, not really. He had built a kingdom on the mechanics of fear and favor and called it civilization. A boy with nothing had proven that civility could be messy and righteous. By morning, the narrative outside the villa had been stitched: high society assassination foiled, Moretti resilience proven, a nameless interloper neutralized. But inside Elias, a different calculus began. Who was this boy? Why had he intervened? And what did his intervention mean for a man whose authority depended on being unassailable? He convened his inner circle, a mix of former soldiers, accountants who could launder an accusation into a footnote, and a handful of young tech minds who had learned to bend code like belief. They returned to him a practical list: locate the boy, interrogate Gabriel Voss, tighten legal snares. The ledger would not be sullied by sentiment. And yet, in the quiet that followed the first wave of PR, Elias found himself taking a different inventory. He thought of the hospital bracelet, and a name that might mean roots in some other family, a hint that Luca had once belonged to a place that had broken him. He thought of the way Luca's fists had sought to protect not a man he knew, but the abstract idea of a man not being used. He thought of his own hands, which had been used, in turn, by fathers and obligations. He had been raised to be an iron fist. Modernity wanted him to be something gleaming and clean. The boy had refused to be passive in either reality. Word from Gabriel's camp arrived in the form of a leaking dossier, smudged emails promising strategic partnerships, a timeline for an acquisition that would have made large swaths of the Moretti network subordinate to an algorithm-driven conglomerate. Gabriel's arrogance was not merely his belief that contracts could topple kingdoms. It was his belief that men like Elias could be converted into shareholders. The leak suggested confidence and impatience in equal measure. Elias frowned over the file. A war announced itself not only in fists and bodies, but in servers and shareholder meetings. He could take the route his advisors preferred: punish the kid, make him an example, ensure no one else confused the rules. He could turn Luca into a lesson. He could bury Gabriel under a mountain of counterclaims. The ledger murmured ease. But in the quiet nights since the attack, Elias had sat with the memory of a small, furious face, and felt an uncommon churn of something dangerously like curiosity. The Moretti Code had always permitted exceptions when a threat came from within the family. Perhaps, he mused, it also permitted the creation of a new sort of family, one that was not only bound by blood and oaths, but by a recognition that the world was changing faster than his old ways could contain. He sent a man to find Luca, not to punish, but to observe. The man was precise, the sort of operative who could read an alley by its smell and note the sound of a boy's laugh in the dark. He traveled with instructions to bring the boy alive. There was a different instruction, written in a hand Elias did not usually use. Find out if the boy knew how to listen to the city's signals, the odd skill of a child who had learned to pick up discarded handsets and eavesdrop on the static between towers. If Luca could do what Elias suspected, if he could listen to fibers and make sense of the noise, then he was not a mere street urchin, he was an asset and a danger. The dilemma settled over Elias like snow. To assimilate the boy into his world would be to risk tenderness that could be exploited. To destroy him would be to deny something about his own past he had never named. There would be enemies to punish, a man with capital to humble, a world that believed contracts could do the killing. But there would also be a child who had chosen violence to stop violence, who had no stake in the ledger, and thus no reason to lie. The choice that presented itself was not strategic. It was personal. As the city throbbed and the Moretti satellite lights blinked their cold Morse across the sky, Elias Moretti lit a cigarette he did not inhale.
He looked at the photograph of his father on the mantel, a stern man who had taught him to hold power like a loaded weapon, and he felt, for the first time in many years, the temptation to do something that was not on any ledger, to pull a boy up from the gutter and place him beside him at his table, and see what would happen if the two of them learned to speak like human beings again. The thought was reckless and scandalous and possibly illegal. It was also the most honest thing he had felt since grief had taught him silence. He had never been one for miracles. His life had been arithmetic, ledgers, margins, favors tallied like coins. Yet the thought of finding Luca shifted something in him from calculation to a dangerous warmth. He could already imagine the caution in his advisors' faces, the way they would draft excuses like armor. He could also imagine Luca in a room with his name on a plaque, the boy's hands hovering over devices designed to map influence rather than mend shoes. That image made him ache. He told the operative to take the longer, quieter route. Observe first. Do not frighten him. Do not touch unless necessary. The operative's reports arrived like breadcrumbs. Luca slept in an abandoned construction site that smelled of coffee grounds and diesel. He kept to a small circle of the city's dispossessed. A woman named Maya who ran the soup line, a teenager with a swagger who fenced stolen phones, and a toddler with silk hair who followed Luca as if he were a lighthouse. The operative wrote that Luca moved with a dancer's economy, that he spoke seldom and listened like a radio picking up faint stations. There were notes about how Luca disassembled a discarded smartphone and had reassembled the screen into something that pulsed with new life, an act that made Elias feel a childish pride, as if he were watching someone he'd taught to tie a knot. But the reports were also candid. Luca had scars older than the night that had made him collide with Gabriel. There was a stoic hardness to him that betrayed a history of abandonment. The operative had watched Luca steal bread for the toddler, then pad away when a social worker approached. He'd seen the boy avoid charity as if it were a dangerous animal, and he'd seen the way Luca laughed, rare, quick, like the click of a lock before someone opens a door. The operative recommended bringing the boy in for questioning under the pretense of witness protection. It was the polite version of coercion. Elias did not move with counsel. He moved with the slow certainty of someone who has been making hard decisions his whole life. He went himself. He found Luca on the fourth night, hunched beneath the sheet of corrugated metal, the city's neon bleeding into his eyes. Elias watched from the shadow of delivery truck, feeling the absurd physical hum of nervousness, his palms slick, his breath a little shorter.
He approached without entourage, because if there was any negotiation to be had, it had to begin as a conversation, not an interrogation. Luca looked up as the big figure stepped into the flicker of streetlight, and for a second the boy's expression was a map of all defenses: suspicion, calculation, the faint curl of amusement that people who have nothing sometimes wear like armor. "You're him," Lucas said without preamble. He said it like he was confirming the existence of a myth. "The one with the house that eats the night." Elias wanted to smile at the description. Instead, he offered his name, Elias Moretti, and nothing more. He took a seat on a crate at the edge of Lucas' shelter, at a distance that respected the boy's airspace. It was a small thing, and in that smallness, a lot of the old world held its breath. "You hit a man who came into my restaurant with a gun," Elias said. He let the words be simple, unadorned. "Why?" Lucas' jaw flexed. For a moment, he didn't answer in words at all. He reached into his pocket and produced the hospital bracelet, the same white band Elias had noticed days before. He turned it over, thumb rubbing the faded writing, then met Elias's eyes. "My ma had that once," Lucas said more softly than his clothes allowed. "She said you should never sign away your name. If you do, you become a thing." Elias watched the boy clutch that small strip of plastic like an altar. Something tight and private in his chest loosened. He thought of the more invisible things people signed away in his world: loyalties, promises, reputations, contracts that functioned like chains. He had been both prisoner and jailer of that code for decades. The revelation of the boy's language, name as altar, hit him where custom and blood had met and left him wounded. "Did you know the man?" Elias asked. "No." Lucas' voice was brittle, the word a shield. "I know men like him." They talked until the city began to unclench. The first hours were careful, as if both of them had misfired and were now deciding whether to reload. Lucas' story seeped out in fragments. A mother who spent her last wages on a train ticket, a father who left debt collectors a trailing echo, a boy moved through shelters and underpasses until he learned to speak machine and survive on scraps. He admitted to the attack with a flat, unperforming honesty. He told Elias that he had seen a man about to make another man less than whole, and had not wanted to be part of that. Elias listened and felt, like a careful surgeon, the stitch of something tender being placed. He offered Lucas soup from a thermos, an offering both literal and symbolic, and Luca accepted as if it were a bribe too small to sting. The conversation moved, haltingly, toward the practical. Gabriel Voss. Elias wanted to know more. Luca had been in the room. His knowledge was limited but meaningful. He had heard names, prices, the hush of deals being made on the wave between business and violence. He had watched the man with a gun, had felt the metallic taste of fear rub his teeth raw. He had no loyalty to Elias. He had only a visceral hatred for being used. When Elias left, he left with the sense that the thread connecting him to the boy might fray, or become a lifeline. He did not expect to return the way he would to any hired hand. He expected to return like a man seeking his own lost humility, which, in the more honest parts of his mind, was scandalous. Gabriel did not wait for the pieces to settle. He made his move with the noisy cruelty of someone who believes the world responds to will and spreadsheets. Press releases dripped from his camp with the cold efficiency of oil on concrete. Voss Enterprises denied any involvement in the assault. A rogue operative had acted, the statement read, and the company was cooperating fully. But the leaks continued. Emails that hinted at back-channel negotiations and a list of subsidiaries that overlapped suspiciously with Moretti Holdings. A smear campaign blossomed in the mouths of pundits. The Morettis were losing grip. Their night had been struck, and a new era required new governance. Elias watched the press feed with the stillness of someone feeling fingers on his throat. He met Gabriel's bravado with quieter, more cunning counters, anonymous calls to journalists with contradictory data, subtle shifts in markets engineered by Moretti-brokered brokers, and a discreet but relentless tightening of protection around the syndicate's assets. He moved like an old tide, slow, inexorable, yet each step took more of his energy than it once had, as if the gears themselves required oil he no longer possessed. Luca, meanwhile, became an irritant in the narrative, not an asset, not a threat, but an anomaly. People with less imagination than Elias proposed the obvious course: erase him, make a spectacle of his disappearance, remind the streets of the cost of meddling. Maja, the soup woman, clung to Luca like a willow, offering shelter, and warned Elias's men in a way that blurred the lines between supplication and command. "Don't take him," she said, "the plea as raw as wound. If you use him, you break him." Elias resented the simplicity of her truth. He disliked how Maja's words folded the wayward possibilities of his life into moral arithmetic. He disliked it so much that he almost obeyed just to spite her.
He had always preferred to do the unfashionable, the unexpected. Yet the reality was that Luca's skill, his listening to signals, his ability to reshape fragments of old tech into functional ears, made him both vulnerable and lethal in the wrong hands. Elias thought of Gabriel's networks, of servers that could be folded into a new kind of rule. He thought of the boy's hands, capable of both mending and wreaking havoc. Luca tested the limits of his autonomy. When a subtle pressure came, men in suits who implied safe harbor for a price, or worse, the kind of protection that made people into badges, he recoiled. He wanted none of the gilded cages Elias had created, yet he understood hunger and cold too well to turn down shelter. This contradiction became the center of a push and pull between them, Elias offering resources and gentle commands, Luca offering suspicion and the potential to be broken. Their relationship hardened into a dangerous, tender negotiation. Elias proposed training. Luca said he wanted to be free. Elias promised safety. Luca wondered whether safety was simply another word for leash. Yet despite their conflicting frames, each meeting fostered small epiphanies. Luca held a map of the city's undercurrent like a lover tracing the hem of a dress. He knew which corners had eyes, which alleys had caches of old routers, which social workers turned a blind eye for the right coin. Elias in turn showed Luca a different map, one drawn in ledgers and arteries of influence, the way deals were made behind flowered boardroom doors and sealed with a look rather than a signature. The boy began to understand that violence and capital were two sides of the same coin. Elias began to see that capital could be a tool for repair, not only acquisition. They also began to share small intimacies. Elias taught Luca how to drink coffee properly, black and hard, the way it kept one honest, while Luca taught Elias to pick a broken router apart without fear. Elias would sit in the corner of the basement training room, a plate of something meager, watching the boy learn to map the city's signals on screens that hummed like distant insects. Elias felt a foolish tenderness bloom within his ribs, a sensation that complicated everything he believed about power. It was dangerous because tenderness begets protection, and protection begets vulnerabilities that could be exploited by Gabriel in a dozen elegant ways. Gabriel understood this, and he used it. He began to whisper to Luca through the city's underbelly, promises laced with nascent wealth, a chance to move out of the gutters and into a life where hunger was a memory. His agents found small ways to court the boy, an extra battery here, a cleaner phone screen there, measured bribes designed to test loyalty and measure resistance. Luca, who had been trained in the city's grammar of suspicion, knew an offer when he saw one. He also knew that whatever he accepted would bind him in invisible ledgers he could not read. The first true fracture came when a man Luca trusted, a boy named Marco who had once shared bread with him, was arrested in a sweep that smelled of staged justice. Marco had been a link between Luca and a ring of fixers who sold old codes to small-time operators. Elias suspected Gabriel's hand. Luca suspected betrayal. The arrest forced a collision between their worlds. Elias wanted an explanation and offered a reprieve in exchange for information.
Luca could not find it in him to trade Marco's freedom for tokens of safety from a man who smelled of expensive leather. Anger and fear created an alchemy between them. Luca's refusal stung Elias with the intimacy of a blow that lands upon a place one keeps hidden, his pride. It forced him to confront how much he had become the kind of man who could say, "This belongs to me," and expect the world to comply. He had called himself protector, and now he faced the possibility that his protection had been the shape of a prison. Luca's defiance felt like a rebuke, but it also stung with a clarity Elias had longed to feel. He retaliated, not with violence, but with candor. He told Luca the truth he kept from the world. He could not unmake the past that had sharpened his hands. He had been forged by fathers who believed mercy a weakness. He had become what he was to prevent worse things from happening. He did not ask for forgiveness, he asked for understanding. For the first time in years, his voice trembled. Luca listened, the way a person listens to a thunderstorm, uncertain, alert to the possibility of danger and awe simultaneously. The boy's eyes, so accustomed to seeing the world in black and white contrasts, searched Elias for lies and found enough honesty to form a new, precarious argument. He told Elias that people like them, people who had learned to rely on private justice, had also tamed each other in ways the law would never understand.
He told Elias that he wanted neither to be used nor to be coddled. He wanted a place that let him be more than a weapon or a salvage. The confession was imperfect and luminous, an awkward offering made of both stubbornness and longing. It created, for a moment, a fragile bridge between them, an understanding that neither could fully inhabit the other's life, but that both could share a small, smoldering space in which to begin again. Outside of their private negotiations, Gabriel escalated. He began to drag Elias's name through legal mud, floated the possibility of regulatory intervention that would force Moretti assets into public trust, and spread rumors about Elias using underage labor, an accusation as ugly as it was calculated. The city hummed with speculation. The boardrooms that had once trembled at Elias's shadow started to ask questions. The syndicate's partners demanded assurances the old man could not always supply. Elias felt the first real pressure in years, not from muscle, but from legitimacy. He had always been more comfortable with limbs and steel than with laws that changed like weather. The idea of losing, not by blood but by bureaucracy and perception, made the old animal in him restless. He doubled down, not by ordering hits, at least not yet, but by exposing weaknesses in Gabriel's empire. He sent tendrils of influence into the markets where Voss's holdings looked most vulnerable. A temporary shorting of the stock here, a regulatory nudge there. Each move was clean, surgical.
The boardrooms responded with panic. Gabriel's investors demanded answers. In the space between these strikes, Luca watched Elias in a way that made the boss uneasy. The boy's gaze no longer ran from him in fear or curiosity alone. It began to hold a something like expectation. There was also the unmistakable stirring of a different, more complicated feeling, something that had a softness inside it, and that made Elias shiver with both excitement and dread. He had not intended for this to become personal. He had not planned on wanting a boy to look at him the way Luca now did, with hunger and accusation folded into trust. When they were alone, Luca would sometimes ask blunt questions about Elias's past, the kind that would make polite men look away. Elias answered, piece by piece, because it hurt less to offer the truth a little at a time than to never say it at all. He told Luca about a father who taught him to make difficult choices, about grief that had been salted into his bones, about the nights he had chosen to order protection over tenderness. He told stories that were not noble, but were true. Luca listened, and sometimes, improbably, he smiled. Their proximity created new dangers, old associates who felt threatened by the possibility of Elias's softening, Gabriel watching like a hawk, and Luca himself, who was both asset and liability. Each day the city tilted under the new weight of their alliance, small, fragile, disapproved of, and impossible to ignore. At night, after the day's moves had been made, and the city's pulse slowed to its nocturnal whisper, Elias would walk the villa's terrace and think of the way Luca had hit Gabriel, raw, unfettered, human. The image had become a lodestar. It reminded him that power could be redirective, that protection could be offered without enslavement. It reminded him that the ledger might be rewritten not with force, but with care. Those thoughts were a kind of treason for a man who had ruled by keeping people balanced on a knife edge, but treason had always had a taste Elias could not entirely hate. And Luca began to test the world with a confidence that surprised him. He hacked small things for good. He rerouted a landlord's surveillance camera to expose a slum landlord's brutality. He found a back door into a health department server to flag a child's medical emergency. He repaired the phone of the toddler who followed him like a shadow. Each act was minor and monumental at once. With each small victory, Luca's belief in his own agency grew. He also began to see Elias not as a mirage of power, but as a complicated man willing to hold space for that growth. The push and pull between them intensified. Trust grew in fits and starts, often derailed by professional necessities and old instincts. Elias's world demanded cruelty sometimes. Luca's demanded freedom. They were learning, clumsily and urgently, how to be in the same universe without sacrificing the shape of themselves.
Gabriel watched their fumbling rapprochement and, confident in his spreadsheets and lawyers, prepared a final, elegant move designed to prove that characters like Elias and boys like Luca could be bought or broken. Neither of them knew then that the pain Gabriel would engineer would carve their fragile truths into something stronger, or shatter them entirely. For now, there was only the slow accumulation of evidence that two people from opposite hemispheres of power could intersect and begin to recalibrate the city's axis. They had not yet become family, but they were walking toward a shared table, each carrying a small private hunger and the hope that the other might somehow understand it. They had been threading toward each other with such careful, exhausted hope that the first blow felt like a betrayal carved from the softest part of the night. It came as a file, an innocuous-looking PDF transmitted through a channel Elias trusted, one he had used for years to move cleanly and quietly when discretion was the currency. Inside the file were surveillance shots: Luca lifting a package from the back of a truck, Luca handing cash to a man with ink-stained fingers, Luca in an alleyway at midnight talking to someone whose face was obscured by a hood. The captions were clinical: association with petty theft ring, transactional exchange, possible conduit for stolen data. The sender's signature was a name Elias had never expected to see betray his correspondence: Matteo, the lieutenant he'd raised like a son, the man who took orders in the shape of loyalty and returned obedience as a gift. Matteo's notes were clean, bellicose with the righteousness of someone covering his own tracks. "For preservation," he wrote, "we must protect the family." Elias burned the file with his eyes before he burned it on the villa's secure terminal. He felt the blood leave his face in stages, the first heat of outrage, the hollow cold of suspicion, then a deeper, older ache, the recognition that the ledger had teeth sharp enough to bite the hands that fed it. He had built systems to keep outsiders out, not to police the conscience of his own. Matteo had been the calm center on which he balanced wars and reconciliations. The thought that he had turned those skills into a noose around Luca's neck felt like watching a lover stitch a fault line into the foundation of a house you were trying to keep. He went to Matteo, but not violently. There was a ritual to these conversations, a formality that had sustained relationships within his world. A single room, deep and windowless, the air always too still. Matteo met him with the chilblain smile of a man who had rehearsed loyalty and perfected the lie. The explanations slid out like an old script, confessions dressed as strategy. The man muttered the word asset as if it were a prayer, and told Elias he had sent the file to the police liaison, who had been waiting for the justification to sweep Lucas' circle.
He had done it, Matteo said, because Elias' gatherings of the dispossessed were a vulnerability, an eye for capital to spit into. It should have been enough, the clean corruption of self-preservation. But Elias heard another truth beneath the lie. Matteo had acted not only for the family, but for fear. For the first time in years, Elias watched a man measure his heart against a ledger and choose the ledger. He realized then that he had taught the men around him how to love only the ledger. He had made it the ultimate god, and they had knelt to it. When Elias confronted Luca with the news, an exchange meant to be a reckoning, he expected fury, yes, but the kind that could be smoothed by an apology and the promise of retribution. He did not expect Luca to become a fisher. "You gave my friend away," Luca said, and the words were small and sharp as glass. He had not shouted. He did not need to. His face had the pale hollowness of someone who had kept grief in his ribcage until it calcified into a different shape: resentment. Luca's hands shook, not with the tremor of weakness, but with the tremor of someone who had felt the ground moved from under him for the last time. Elias tried to explain. He told Luca that Matteo had acted without his consent. He told him about the leak, about Gabriel's pressure and the ways men of influence moved like oil through the city's components. He told him things he rarely told anyone, that he had called in favors to stall the sweep, that he had plans to scramble Matteo's alliances, that he had meant to protect, not expose, Luca's circle. But explanations in his world are only as strong as the hand that offers them, and Luca could see the tremors in Elias's face as easily as Elias could see the scars on Luca's knuckles. "You said you weren't going to use us," Luca breathed. The phrase was not accusatory exactly. It was incredulous, the way a child looks at a parent who has taken a toy and put a price on it. "You said you would not make us into weapons." Elias felt the old scaffolding of his authority creak. He had built a language where people were currencies, where loyalty was something to be administered rather than nurtured. Now, one of the few things that had ever felt like a clean human response, Luca's refusal to be weaponized, was counted as insolence. It should not have stung like this. It stung because he had begun, foolishly, to imagine a different arrangement,
a relationship not founded on utility, but on something more dangerous, more tender. Luca's betrayal, or what he took for betrayal, was not a single action, but a revelation. Elias had become the kind of man whose love required accounting. Luca had grown up in a world where every favor had a tally, and he had promised himself he would never become someone else's balance sheet.
To discover that the softest hand he'd allowed into his life, Ilias, also wanted to place him on a ledger, was the most painful proof that power made monsters of everyone, even those who pretended to be humane. Their break was not theatrical. No doors slammed, no dramatic declarations were made on the villa steps. It was quieter, and therefore more devastating. Luca left that night with his backpack and the toddler's patched blanket, eyes burned into Ilias' memory like a warning sign. He did not return calls. He did not accept the food parcels left in the alley by Maja. He was gone, as if he'd never been. And the vacancy he left was a raw, yelling silence. Meanwhile, Gabriel smelled the fracture and moved with the predatory grace of a storm front. He leaked doctored footage, edited clips that suggested Ilias himself had sanctioned the sweeps, that he'd used juvenile labor in clandestine data farms for the syndicate's benefit. The story was ugly because it made plausible the thing Ilias feared most, that the world would prefer a neat villain over a complicated man. Investors ran cold. Politicians whispered about regulation. Matteo, sensing the tide, offered Ilias a bargain disguised as loyalty: trade Luca's disappearance for Matteo's continued fealty. The offer was a guillotine beveled with politeness. Ilias refused in private and considered the calculus in public. He knew how to make men disappear, how to arrange for settlements and seals that cleansed reputations as effectively as washing dirt from a plate. But he also knew that removing Luca would mean staining his hands with the same colors he had spent his life trying to keep in the abstract: control, fear, and ownership. The choice should have been easy according to the ledger, because the ledger rewarded coldness. But the ledger's logic had been undermined by something Ilias never fully admitted to himself: attachment. There was another fracture, more secret, that the leaks hid like a second knife. Matteo's betrayal was not merely about fear or expedience. He had been courted by Gabriel with promises that spoke to a weakness in everyone who grows up in a world of second chances: absolution. Gabriel had offered Matteo protection from debts he had incurred in youth, legal cover for a transgression Ilias never knew about. Gabriel had inked the offers with the convenient illusion of generosity and the cruel calculus of power, both of which Matteo found impossible to refuse. What Matteo had not expected was the way Gabriel used the acquired footage of Luca to etch his own narrative into Ilias's world: that the Mafia boss had become sentimental and thus vulnerable, that his power could be taken not with bullets, but with PR and legalities. When Ilias discovered Matteo's secret meeting with Gabriel, a photograph of two men clasped in the handshake of conspirators, something ancient and private in him snapped. He had built a family founded on the idea that you take a bullet for the man beside you. He had taught the men around him that loyalty was both a shield and a debt. To find Matteo on the other side of the table, trading the family's honor for personal safety, felt like watching a church altar crucified by its own parishioners. Elias's reaction was not violence, though the thought came, sharp and bright, but an empty, desperate grief that made him stagger like a man who had been struck across the chest. The fractures multiplied. Luca, in the city's edges, heard the stories that Gabriel fed the press and felt the world tilt underfoot, the same world he'd tried to assault with a fist to save someone he didn't know. He read about himself in papers as a thief, as a pawn, as a danger that needed to be excised. The language of the pages normalized his erasure. He felt, with the bitter clarity of a boy who had never had much, that everyone had a price, and that the price for belonging to Elias had been a cost he wasn't willing to pay. In the villa, Elias watched the city's whispers turn into orders. His men urged him to be remorseless. An example, Matteo mouthed on a secure line: "We cannot show weakness." There was a hunger for proofs, proof that the family still commanded the shape of the city. Elias could feel the animal that had always been his, ancient, precise, and merciless, pulling at his sleeve, like a hand tugging at a sleeve to be let out. For the first time, he felt at war not only with outside enemies, but with the nature of a power that had made him into someone his heart now refused to fully believe in. The result was an implosion of intimacy.
The fragile trust between Elias and Luca cracked under pressure, and in the fissure 1,000 shards reflected possible futures, some bright and new, some monstrous and inevitable. Matteo's betrayal had revealed a truth Elias had been clinging to with the desperation of a drowning man, that his world consumed the tender things he tried to protect. Gabriel's manipulations had made that truth public. Night after night, Elias paced the villa's hallways, each footstep a small confession. He had to choose. He could reassert the ledger, crush Luca into an object lesson, and reclaim an old version of power that had never allowed for mistakes. Or he could do something no ledger taught him, sacrifice his own standing, engage in a public act of defiance against his code, and reveal, to the world and to his men, that he would not trade a child's life for the comfort of his legacy. He had come to believe in promises, but promises, he now realized, were only sacred if someone was willing to lose something to keep them. The only question left hanging in the winter air was how far he was willing to go to honor a vow he had whispered to himself in the dark: keep the streets from eating their children. The ledger screamed for a simple arithmetic answer. His heart, broken and new and dangerously foolish, demanded something else entirely.
Elias walked into the light like a man who had decided which part of himself he was willing to burn. He called a press conference not because he could not buy silence, but because he could not bear the idea of the boy's name being erased behind a mountain of hush money and legalese. Cameras crowded the villa's garden like curious birds. The city's breath seemed to pause. Matteo watched from the edge, all of his composure borrowed and brittle. Elias let the microphone scratch their hungry questions. He could have crafted a speech to shield himself, to veer truth into a lane of plausible deniability. Instead, he laid the ledger open and let the pages sour with honesty. "I have done terrible things," Elias said, voice flat as iron and twice as tired. "I have kept an order that demanded failures become invisible. I believed that making people afraid was a way to keep them from being hurt. I was wrong." The room hummed. Gabriel's lawyers circulated outrage like vultures. Elias watched their faces as surely as he watched his own hands, which did not shake. He named Matteo by sight of betrayal, recounted the file that had been planted, and then, because he would not allow the ledger to consume the boy in its accounting, he said aloud the truth that pierced him most: "I will not let a child pay for my sins." It was a small miracle in his world, the pledge of a mafia boss to a wronged child, offered not as weaponized PR, but as sacrament. Elias turned toward Matteo then, and not with the violence the room expected. His voice was low, almost intimate. "You betrayed us," he said. "You betrayed me. For that, there will be a reckoning, but not in ways that ruin a life for a fear you manufactured." Matteo's throat worked. The man had chosen leverage over honor and found only ash. Elias stripped him of command, sent him away to satellite safehouses where his movements could be watched and, if necessary, traded. It was a banishment that tasted like mercy and punishment in equal measure. Elias hoped it would hurt in a way that would teach rather than erase. Then Elias did something stupider and truer than any of his men expected. He offered himself as a shield. He handed over dossiers of his own misdeeds to a journalist he trusted, an old woman whose pen had learned to slice through illusions, on the condition that the story would buy time and expose Gabriel's machinations. The leaks were surgical, exposing back-channel meetings and forged contracts that tied Voss Enterprises to companies that trafficked in secrecy. Gabriel had spent a lifetime believing truth could be purchased. Elias's counter was uglier and noisier, and it worked. Investors faltered. Regulators opened files. Gabriel, for the first time, looked like a man weathering his own collapse. But the battle was not only public, it was physical and small in ways that mattered.
Elias sent a team that moved through the city at dusk, quiet, precise, to the detention center where Marco and several of Luca's friends had been swept up. They found weak threads of evidence: a bribed clerk, a sympathetic guard who owed a favor. Elias paid in a currency he had not used in years. Favors returned, without the expectation of repayment. Marco walked out into the cold night, holding a bag of stolen phones and a cigarette he did not get to light. He looked at Elias then, and in the way children give thanks when adults act like adults, Marco nodded. Luca saw it on the street corner where he had been sleeping, the movement of a man stepping into liberty, and the figure of another willing to stake everything to make it happen. When Luca first saw Elias on that corner, the city's neon washing both men in an indifferent blur, his instinct was to run. He stood with his hands in his pockets, the toddler curled around his leg, and watched. Elias approached without the retinue, with nothing but a thermos and a worn pair of gloves. He knelt, this time not to enforce but to equalize, and offered Luca the gloves. "You can choose," he said simply. "No contracts, no ledgers. If you want me to fight for you, I will. If you want me to step back, I will." Luca looked at the gloves like a suspicious animal, and then at Elias like someone reading a promise aloud for the first time. There was no heat, no seduction, only the dangerous, human ache of two damaged people deciding whether they could be less lonely together. Luca took the gloves. He did not take Elias's name as payment. He took it as an option. The climax came not in a shootout, but in a kind of demolition. Elias's men, together with benevolent hackers from the small community Luca had once trusted, executed a counterstrike on Gabriel's data. Luca himself sat in the dim room, fingers moving like prayer over keyboards he had learned to love. He found backdoors, patched vulnerabilities, rerouted incriminating files to public servers. The work was intimate and terrifying. The boy who had learned to take apart discarded phones now dismantled a billionaire's lies. Seeing him there, focused, fierce, Elias felt something like fear for the first time in years, not because his reign might end, but because his heart might. They paid a price. Gabriel retaliated by exposing selective truths about Elias's early violence. The press cooked a feast of historical sins. Investors fled. Polite society tutted. Elias let them. He had traded control for the chance to keep a boy and his small constellation of friends from vanishing into a system that consumed the weak. He surrendered little of his power, enough to be dangerous in a different way. The price was a battered public image and a few more sleepless nights. The gain was more precious. Luca's life, unpaid for and unowned.
After it all, when the city had calmed into a cautious dusk and Gabriel's influence had been shredded into long legal arguments, Elias and Luca sat on the villa's low wall, feet dangling over a cortile that smelled of lemon trees and motor oil. Marco and the toddler were there too, laughing in a way that made something in Elias melt he could not name. Luca leaned his head against Elias's shoulder, a small, casual claim that was not romantic in any illicit sense, but was instead a sanctuary, a touch that said he trusted this man to keep a promise without putting a price on it. Elias turned his face and kissed the top of Luca's head, because that was the only language left to him for things that were too tender for words. It was a kissing that belonged to a father, to a guardian, to a man learning that love could be a shield rather than a ledger. Luca did not flinch. He hummed, a sound like someone who had been given back a small piece of sky. They had not healed everything. Matteo's treachery had not been fully punished, and Gabriel's lawyers would keep clawing. Elias's empire would have to be reshaped, precious alliances severed and new ones formed without the old coercion. Yet in that quiet, each man held the other in a way beyond ownership. Elias with his decision to lose face and power rather than a life. Luca with his willingness to accept care when it came without chains. The city outside continued to spin, cold and indifferent, but there in the villa's shadowed courtyard, two unlikely lives folded into a small, fragile ordinariness. Elias thought of promises again, but this time not as contracts inked in blood and fear, but as choices you made even when they cost you everything. He had paid a different kind of ransom, his reputation, and for the first time in many years, the ledger on his desk contained a single entry that was not arithmetic, but grace. They slept later that morning than either of them expected. Elias on a couch that smelled faintly of leather polish and lemon, Luca on a scratched cot across the room, the toddler curled against his hip like a secret. When they woke, the city had not forgiven them nor fully condemned them. It had merely shifted its attention elsewhere, which for now counted as mercy. Matteo's exile turned into a slow dissolution. He was given safe houses and surveillance in exchange for silence, and the humiliation of being stripped of command was sharper than any blade Elias might have used. It did not feel like justice so much as a lesson carved into the margins of a life that had once believed itself unassailable. Gabriel's legal storms receded into the kind of attrition that takes years, lawyers, and indignity. Some investors left, others recalibrated. Elias's empire was smaller, yes, but less hungry in ways that mattered. It required reweaving, new allies built not on fear but on negotiated interest. That work would take time and cost sleepless nights, but it would not demand the sacrifice of other people's bodies to stay standing. Luca found work that was neither gilded nor degrading. A contact from the small hacker community, someone who owed a favor, helped him secure a modest stipend and a part-time apprenticeship at a civic tech nonprofit that repaired phones and taught kids to code. It was imperfect, the hours were long, the pay thin. But the work let him use the skill that had saved Gabriel's humiliation on a morning of violence for reasons that did not turn people into property. Marco took on odd jobs with the construction crew, and, more importantly,
learned to stay, a small rebellion against the instinct that made him run. They rebuilt trust with gestures rather than proclamations. Elias stopped offering solutions as orders and began to offer choices. He spent mornings in the courtyard answering questions about legal loopholes and afternoons listening to Luca rant about programming languages with the reverence of a preacher. Luca, in turn, let the villa hold him in small increments: a borrowed blanket, a plate of warm food, an insistence that he take breakfast before stepping out into the city. He refused titles and kept his independence like a talisman, but he accepted an arrangement that allowed him to return when the nights were rough and the toddler needed medicine. The toddler, who everyone called Nico, grew fat on soup and attention. Maja moved into a small apartment paid for by a discreet trust Elias set up. She became a fixture at the villa's kitchen table, an unbiddable force who would neither be thanked enough nor paid enough to be satisfied. Her presence was a living contract that none of the ledgermen could draft, love performed without expectation of return. Months later, when the villa lights came on and the city hummed in its tired, familiar way, Elias and Luca walked the garden together. They did not speak of empires or betrayals. They spoke of small things, how a router could be coaxed back to life, whether lemon trees liked pruning in March. Luca reached up and plucked a small green lemon, handing it to Elias with a crooked smile. Elias took it, feeling its weight like an answer. He held it between his fingers for a long time, then smashed it gently into a cup of tea and offered the cup to Luca. The boy accepted and sipped, heat rising into his cheeks like a dawn. They had not erased the past. They had made a new kind of ledger, one kept not in accounts, but in hands held, meals shared, nights kept. Outside, the city continued its old transactions of appetite and commerce, but inside the villa, a lemon tree, a cot, a cup of tea, two unlikely people had carved a fragile equilibrium. It was not power, not mercy, but something closer to kinship, messy, stubborn, and real. Elias watched Luca lean against him, small and steady, and thought of the promise he'd once whispered into darkness.
The ledger on his desk remained, but beside it, a fresh entry, a name written without price. He closed his eyes and let the sound of the city wash over them like rain, ordinary, persistent, and somehow forgiving.